Hi everyone, it's Brian here, and I'm back with what I'm telling myself will be a short video, but I suspect it might be a bit longer than I intend. And it's actually a follow-up video to the one that I did yesterday on the tarot court cards. And that video was part of my Tarot to the Nines series. This video is standalone. But the reason I'm doing it is because there was quite a few things that I wasn't able to cover in yesterday's video in as much detail as I would have liked. And it's quite clear from the conversation that we've been having in the Facebook group for Tarot to the Nines, and also in the comment section of the video itself that I did yesterday, that there's still quite a lot more to discuss and that people are interested in learning more about the court cards. And what seemed to be of most interest to people and also seemed to cause most confusion is the idea of the differences of elemental attributions, and why is it that some tarotists attribute certain elements to certain cards, etc, etc, and what about the other systems like astrology and so on and so forth. And one of the things that came out really clearly was people being interested in knowing how cards within the Rider-Waite-Smith deck relate to other tarot systems like the Thoth system, etc. So what I thought I would do is a video on that very topic. And whereas in yesterday's video we looked at the court cards through the number perspective and through the elements, and we talked about the way that they can operate as different families and representatives of people, either yourself or other people, or facets of personality, either of your own or other people's. Today what I want to do is to really focus on the way that those court cards within different decks have been kind of constructed and how they connect together. And in particular, we're going to be looking at a comparison between a Marseille deck, so to represent the kind of original continental decks that tarot originated from, the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, because it's so popular, and also Aleister Crowley's Thoth deck. Because what's interesting is that both Arthur Edward Waite and Aleister Crowley were influenced by the same sources, but they ended up with decks that are actually quite different in the way that they express themselves. So we'll get to that in a second, but I thought what might be useful to do is to have a very quick history lesson. And this is a very, very truncated history of the development of tarot. Maybe it's better if I come this side so you can see it. I hope I'm not in shadow. So, as many of us will know, tarot appeared in the middle of the 15th century as a game. The century before that, playing cards had started to arrive in Europe, and really originally it was a game. That's what it was a card game. Then in about 1781, two esotericists, try saying that when your teeth aren't in, de Gebelin and de Maillet, published a work called Le Monde Primitif, and in that work they related the tarot cards for the first time, as far as we know, to the Hebrew letters, the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, which of course are associated to the Jewish Kabbalah. And so there's some beginnings of esoteric tarot in this development. In 1788, the Italia Tarot was published, and that's the first published tarot deck that seemed to very concretely and very overtly link tarot cards to the process of divination. So divination was introduced as something that you could specifically do with tarot cards. Fast forward into the 1850s, and we find that two occultists, Eliphas Levi and Paul Christian, start writing about the tarot. Eliphas Levi began to associate the tarot more specifically with the Kabbalah, so we start to see lots of Kabbalistic associations appearing. And Paul Christian was the first person, again as far as we know, who started to refer to the different segments of the tarot deck as the major arcana and the minor arcana. Then, and this is the bit that's really significant for this video, in 1887, around about then, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was formed, and that's a magical order that composed many different people with different interests. Arthur Edward Waite and Aleister Crowley were both members of that, and what the Golden Dawn did with tarot was, well, what didn't they do with tarot? They effectively looked at tarot in an esoteric sense, and they included everything that had gone before, the links to Kabbalah and the Hebrew letters, the majors, the minors, divination, geomancy, etc, 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 and also astrology. They began to really integrate the concept of again, you need your teeth in to do this kind of video, astrological associations. they worked them in very concretely and very, very clearly. An influential work within the Golden Dawn was something called Book T, that was written by Samuel MacGregor Mathers, and that work actually described how to construct a Golden Dawn tarot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to link for you below a link to Book T, so you can see that for yourself and you can download your own copy of it. And it was that work that influenced the development of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which was published in 1909 by Arthur Edward Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith as the artist, of course. And then a few years later, between 1938 and 1943, Aleister Crowley constructed his Thoth tarot. It wasn't actually published until 1969. He published the Book of Thoth, which described the tarot, in about 1944, just after the deck was published, but it didn't actually get published as a deck until 1969. And by that point, both Aleister Crowley and Lady Frida Harris, the artist for the deck, were both dead. So what I'm going to focus on this video in particular is the links between Book T and the descriptions of the Golden Dawn deck within Book T, and how that influenced both the Rider-Waite-Smith deck and the Crowley-Harris Thoth deck. And what we'll also see is that, to probably a greater extent than Crowley, Arthur Edward Waite was influenced by the continental decks that appeared originally. And we're going to see why in a second. So let me clear the board and let's do some card comparisons. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at how some of the court cards compare. And what I have here on the board is the standard naming that probably most of us are used to for a family of court cards: Page, Knight, Queen, King. And I have the Page, the Knight, the Queen and the King from Yoav Ben-Dov's CBD Tarot de Marseille. And this is to represent the original tarot decks, the continental tarot decks that where the tarot cards originated from. And this probably is the configuration of the courts that most of us are familiar with, not least because they accord very well with the Rider-Waite-Smith court attributions. And, you know, the reason we're so familiar, or one of the reasons we're so familiar with these, of course, is because the Rider-Waite-Smith deck is the most popular deck in the world, and it is the deck that most of us, or many of us at least, learned with and are most familiar with. And it is the deck that I've been using in my Tarot to the 9 series. And you can instantly see that between this deck and these cards representing the continental tarot, there are some clear comparisons just in the way that the images look. So the Page is standing holding on to his baton or his wand. The Knight of Wands is on his horse and is charging forward, full of energy, full of life, full of vigour. The Queen of Wands is sitting there with her wand in her hand on a throne, and the King of Wands is there again on his throne, governing his land with his wand in his hand. So some fairly clear, fairly obvious comparisons. Now, it's worth saying at this point that over the years, when occultists began to look at tarot through an occult lens and began to start to make esoteric attributions to the tarot, one of the things that they obviously did was they started to attribute elements to each of the cards, because magicians, you know, they deal in elements. That's one of the things that magicians do a lot of. They do elemental magic, and they're interested in the way that the elements relate to different things. And all kinds of interesting things began to happen in that kind of occult revival, where they would look at the way that the different elements associated with the different court cards. They would also associate the letters of the Tetragrammaton, the Yod He Vav He, to the different court cards, etc., etc. And all kinds of interesting writings began to proliferate. However, they didn't all agree with each other, so different occultists would assign different attributions to different court cards. And as a result, one of the things that has begun to happen is some confusion, particularly over the Knight and the King and their attributions. Generally, it's accepted that the Pages are earth and that the Queens are water. The Queens are almost universally accepted as being water. Pages are generally accepted as being earth, although some people see them as being air because they're a bit more flighty and less defined, perhaps. But the Knights and the Kings are variously described as either being air or fire, or air or fire. So some people would see the knights as being obviously fiery because they are, you know, energetic and charging forward, and they're full of that kind of vigor, and fire is the most powerful and energetic of the element, if you want to look at it in that sense. That's arguable, of course, because wind can be powerful and mountains can be powerful and so on, but it's seen as being very, very energetic and in accord with this kind of motion of a knight in armour riding forward. And then in terms of the kings, sometimes the kings are seen to be more associated with air, because they of course have to govern, they have to think things through, they have to make judgments in order to be good rulers and good leaders. But then again, if fire is that most kind of powerful primal element, then perhaps the king should be fire. So lots of debate happens around, are the kings fire, are they air, are the knights fire, are they air? And in the last video I talked about some of that and talked about the importance of working out an elemental attribution system for yourself. Now, where it gets slightly complicated is when dear old Aleister Crowley comes on the scene, and he does his Thoth deck. Now remember, I said to you earlier that the Rider-Waite deck and Aleister Crowley's Thoth deck were influenced very heavily by the Valley de Bâton is on the floor. What does this mean? It just means I probably breathed too hard. So let's prop him or her, because of course pages can be either sex. Refer to my previous video. Prop him back on the board. Crowley and Waite were both influenced by Book T, which was written by Samuel MacGregor Mathers, and that outlined instructions for constructing a Golden Dawn deck. And both of these decks in their own way are types of Golden Dawn deck, or certainly Golden Dawn influenced deck. So, do they match up? Well, generally it's accepted that princesses relate to pages, and that's fairly universally acknowledged. There's no real problem there. Same with queens. Queens relate to queens across all of these different decks. No problem there. And you can even see in this card, here we've got the Queen of Wands with her cat in front of her holding onto her wand, and here we've got her holding onto her wand with a crown on a throne and her cat next to her. Slightly bigger cat, more big cat than this little cat, who is clearly Maya, my little cat. We know this. But there's a definite relationship there. Where it gets complicated is in the knight and the king. And the first time you open the Thoth deck, if you're not familiar with it, one of the things you'll notice is there is no king. There are no kings in any of the courts. What the Thoth deck has is knights. Well, we're used to knights, so let's prop the knight back up there. Good old. We're so far so good. Oh dear, now we have a prince. So, does the prince fit with the king, or does the prince sit alongside the princess next to the princess, and does the knight represent the king? Now, what confuses things is a number of people assume that because the prince obviously works with the princess, that the prince is the equivalent of the knight within the Thoth deck, and therefore the knight is the equivalent of the king. And it's further confused by various writings, including some by Aleister Crowley himself, who describes the knight as being like a king, being kingly. Let me just move that down so you can see them a bit more clearly. And so absolutely kind of relates the idea of the knight being like kings. And so what people will do is they will start to say, well, that explains why the knight is fire in this deck, and then it's fire in this deck. So the knights are fire because they're kings, and that means the king's fire. And does that mean that the prince and the knight are air? And it all gets very confusing. One of the reasons it gets confusing is because Arthur Edward Waite and Aleister Crowley interpreted Book T in somewhat different ways in terms of their namings of the cards. So for just a moment, I want you to forget what the cards are called, and we are going to have a look into Book T to see if we can find some connections. Okay, so I've got Book T in front of me, and I'm going to link a copy of this below so you can have your very own copy of Book T. You can download it. It's available as a free PDF on the internet. So here is what is important in relation to the description of the court cards in Book T. So this is how to construct a Golden Dawn Tarot. The 16 are royal cards. The 4 kings. The 4 kings are figures mounted on steeds, represent the yod forces of the name in each suit. The radix, father, and commencement of material forces, a force in which all the others are implied, and out of which they form the development and completion. A force swift and violent in its action, but whose effect soon passes away, and therefore symbolized by a figure on a steed riding swiftly and clothed in complete armor. Okay. That's a bit confusing, because the king there, the knight is on a steed, therefore surely the knight is the king, and the king there is not on a steed, but the knight there is, so that's kind of confusing. Then we have the queens. The 4 queens are seated upon thrones, representing the force of the he of the name in each suit, yod he, vav he, the mother and bringer forth of material forces, the force which develops and realizes that of the king, a force steady and unshaken, but not rapid, though enduring. Then we have the 4 princes. These princes are figures seated in chariots, and thus borne forward. Now there are no chariots in the Rider-Waite deck, but there are in the Thoth deck. These princes are figures seated in chariots and thus borne forward. They represent the vo forces of the name in each suit, yod he, vo he, the mighty son of the king and queen, who realizes the influence of both scales of force. A prince, the son of a king and queen, yet a prince of princes and a king of kings. An emperor, whose effect is at once rapid, though not so swift as that of the queen, and enduring. And it is therefore symbolized by a figure born in a chariot and clothed in armor. Now that's even more confusing, because we've got knights, we've got princes, we've got kings, and we've got emperors referred to in that paragraph. And then the 4 princesses are the knaves of the tarot pack. The 4 princesses are figures of Amazons standing firmly of themselves, neither riding upon horses, nor seated upon thrones, nor borne in chariots. They represent the force of the final he of the name in each suit, yod he, vav he, completing the influences of the other scales. The mighty and potent daughter of a king and queen, a princess powerful and terrible. A queen of queens, an empress, whose effect combines those of the king, queen, and prince, at once violent and permanent, therefore symbolized by a figure standing firmly by itself, only partially draped, and having but little armor. So, those descriptions, just looking at these cards from Book T and the Golden Dawn Tarot, relate clearly, more closely in terms of imagery, to the Thoth deck than they do to the Rider-Waite deck. But what's somewhat confusing is that they're talking very much about kings being mounted on steeds. And in this deck, there is no king. There's a knight mounted on steeds. And in the Rider-Waite deck, there is a king, but there is no king mounted on a steed. So let's have a look a bit more specifically at the cards themselves in terms of this suit, and see if we can understand a bit more about which card is being described by Book T. So, the Queen of Wands, a crowned queen with long red golden hair, seated upon a throne with steady flames beneath. She wears a corselet and buskins of scale mail, which latter her robe discloses. Her arms are almost bare. Blah 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 blah. She bears a long wand with a very heavy conical head. The face is beautiful and resolute. Adaptability, steady force applied to an object, steady rule. At her side is a couchant leopard on which her hands rest. So, that describes this card pretty well. And the closest card in the Rider-Waite deck it describes, of course, is this one, but the little cat is there instead of the leopard, and her arms aren't bare, but she has got a crown on. So there is something there that is a definite comparison. And if we look at the Knave of Wands, a very strong and beautiful woman with flowing red gold hair, attired like an Amazon. Her shoulders, arms, bosom and knees are bare. She wears a short kilt reaching to the knee. Round her waist is a broad belt of scale mail, etc., etc. Now, that kind of describes this card rather better than that one, but we have got a comparison in terms of two figures standing on their own. So now let's have a look at the Knight and the King. So in terms of the King of Wands, according to Book T, a kingly figure with a golden winged crown seated on a chariot. He has large white wings. One wheel of his chariot is shown. He wears corselet and buskins of scale armour decorated with a winged lion's head, which symbol also surmounts his crown. His chariot is drawn by a lion. His arms are bare, save for the shoulder pieces of the corselet, and he bears a torch or fire wand, somewhat similar to that of the Zelator Adeptus Minor. Beneath the chariot are flames, some waved, some salient. Now, that describes this card rather better than that one. So let's move that one out of the way, and in the place of King, let's forget the name and let's put the Prince. And just while we do that, let's just notice that although we've now moved the Prince there into the position of King, we begin to see in this card, although there's not a chariot, it's not being pulled by a lion, etc., etc., there are lions appearing on the card. So there is a comparison there, and it's a seated figure. So there are some similarities between these cards. So let's see if we can find a similarity between the knights. So the Knight of, oh hang on, let me find it, I've lost it. The Knight of Wands, a winged warrior riding upon a black horse with flaming mane and tail. The horse itself is not winged. The rider wears a winged helmet, like the old Scandinavian and Gaulish helmet, with a rayed crown, a corselet of scale mail and buskins of the same, and a flowing scarlet mantle. Above his helmet, upon his cuirass, and on the shoulder pieces and buskins, he wears as a crest a winged black horse's head. He grasps a club with flaming ends, somewhat similar to that in the symbol of the Ace of Wands, but not so heavy, etc., etc. Now, that matches there, and again we see that this is the card that is closest to this card in terms of the description. So what we find now is that if you look at the Book T descriptions and you haven't got names on these, the page of the Rider-Waite relates to the Princess of the Thoth. The Knight of the Rider-Waite relates to the Knight of the Thoth. The Queen of Wands of the Rider-Waite relates to the Queen of the Thoth deck. And the King relates not to the Knight, as we thought, but to the Prince. So, whereas some people would see the Thoth deck as being ordered Princess, Prince, Queen and Knight, in actual fact the comparisons are Princess, Knight, Queen and Prince. The only problem is that suggests that there is a particular order, and we think then the King and the Queen and the Prince and the Queen are the mother and father, and the Knight is the son, etc., etc. But actually we're making assumptions there that this is how the family fits together. We can look at these cards individually. We can look at them just as cards within themselves. And if we do that, then what we find is that these are the equivalents. And you also find then that the elemental attributions match up together. And actually in Book T gives you the elemental attributions. And if we look in Book T at the elemental attributions of the wand suit, the wand suit is fire. And sure enough, the Knave of Wands, or the Page of Wands, or the Princess of Wands, we're told that it's earth of fire, so it represents the earth element. The Queen of Wands, as we might expect, is water of fire, so it represents the water element. And then here, in terms of the Knight and the Prince, the Knight is fire of fire. So the Knight of Wands is seen to be the fiery part of the suit, and that kind of relates to the idea then of fire fitting in with being the Knight, and the Prince then becomes air. So the Prince is the air element, and that makes the King the air element as the equivalent. And therefore, in some ways, this seems to be slightly more elegant in terms of the Page, the Knight, Queen, and the King in terms of their elemental attributions. if you match these up together. But in terms of correspondences, the Rider-Waite-Smith King relates to and corresponds to the Thoth Prince, and the Rider-Waite-Smith Knight relates and corresponds to the Thoth Knight. So here's another way of showing it. Book T, Princess, Prince, Queen and King. The Princess in Book T, the Golden Dawn system, relates to the Page in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck and the Princess in the Thoth deck. The Prince in Book T relates to the King in the Rider-Waite-Smith system and the Prince in the Thoth system. The Queen in the Book T system relates to the Queen in the Rider-Waite-Smith system and the Queen in the Thoth system. Good old Queens, they never let us down. And the King in Book T relates to the Knight in the Rider-Waite-Smith system and the Knight in the Thoth system. So the energies that are described in Book T as representing Princess, Prince, Queen and King flow through into these cards using slightly different names. And the confusion comes because I think of our assumption that a king is the ultimate ruler. But bear in mind, and I mentioned this in my previous video as well, that actually in the UK we have a queen who is the head of state. She is the monarch, and her consort is actually the prince. So it kind of makes sense then that the royal couple, the family, are actually the queen and the prince, and the princess and the king, who represents that kind of knightly energy, who's about to be a king in waiting, is actually represented by the knights. So where it gets confusing is if you try to make the names all match up and the elements all match up, then it gets difficult. It's one of the reasons I suggest to you that you find one system that works for you and you stick to it. It's very interesting to look at how all these different systems fit together, but it can get confusing if you try to get them to fit together perfectly. There's a logic to all of this, but the names can be confusing. So to finish with, I'd just like to loop back a bit to the idea of elements in relation to the cards, because it's really where some of the initial debate started from. And so I want to have a look very quickly at some of the astrological associations that were given to these cards by the members of the Golden Dawn. And what I've done here is I've written up the Golden Dawn list of kings, queens, princes and princesses, and then their equivalents in the Rider-Waite-Smith system. So remember, the kings in the Golden Dawn became knights in the Rider-Waite-Smith system, queens remain queens, princes became kings, and princesses became pages. And in Crowley's system, kings became what the Golden Dawn referred to as kings became knights, but are also knights for the Rider-Waite-Smith system. The queens stayed the same, of course, good old queens. The princes became or remained princes in the Thoth system, and that's the equivalent of the kings in the Rider-Waite-Smith system, and princesses remained princesses in Thoth, and that's the equivalent of the pages. Now what Aleister Crowley did was he allocated different quadrants of the zodiac to different court cards, and each court card got a set of coordinates within the zodiacal wheel, part of one sign, 10 degrees of one sign and 20 degrees of another sign. And the sign that they have 20 degrees of is the kind of dominant sign. And the way that it works is that looking at the Thoth deck, the knights dominate or look after the mutable signs, the queens look after the cardinal signs, and the princes look after the fixed signs. And it follows then, in terms of the Golden Dawn system, kings are looking after mutable, queens cardinal, princes fixed, and princesses and pages and so on don't actually look after any signs at all. They're looking after quadrants of the zodiac and also the seasons. And what that means is that in terms of the Golden Dawn kings, the Rider-Waite-Smith knights and the Thoth knights, they are looking after the mutable signs of Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius and Pisces, and of course they relate to their relevant suit. So in Thoth, the Knight of Swords looks after Gemini because it's an air suit. The Knight of Wands looked after Sagittarius because it is a fire suit. The Knight of Pentacles looked after Virgo because Pentacles is the earth suit, and Knight of Cups looks after Pisces because it is the water suit, and so on and so forth for the others. But the reason I wanted to show you that was because there's a great deal of discussion about what the elemental attributions are. And people do have different elemental attributions that they like to apply to the card based on how they see those cards acting as characters. So we begin to see that some people would perhaps see the pages or the equivalent of the princesses, etc., as being related to air, as the air element. But in actual fact, in terms of the astrological association from the Golden Dawn system, the pages don't have an elemental attribution. So there are different ways of looking at this, and again it goes back to pick a system that you like and one that you enjoy working with. I think there's a lot to be said for exploring the system that the Golden Dawn put together. They weren't playing around when they looked at how these things fitted together. And there's a lot to be said for the way that they actually relate the cards to their elemental attributions. Where we can get into trouble is if we start trying to mix these systems together, because then it can get confusing and we start thinking that cards that have got the same name are the same cards. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. And then in terms of elements, we think that if we're going to attribute elements based on the characteristics of the card, that will then follow through if we start trying to look at the astrological associations. And we might find that when we do that, we can get a bit confused and unstuck. So it's very complicated, but it's also very simple if you allow it to be. The main thing is, and I mentioned this in my previous video about the court cards, find the system that works for you. I know some tarot card readers who don't follow any of these systems and they just work intuitively based on what the cards mean. And I've had the experience, when I do one-to-one readings, I tend to do very interactive readings. So if a court card comes up for the person I'm reading for, before I leap into, oh, this is fire of earth, and therefore and it's got that astrological association and so on, and therefore it means this, I am likely to say to them, what does that card say to you? Who, what might it represent, or who might it represent? I usually get them to start by describing the card. I had an experience not all that long ago, and I've got permission to share this. I was working with somebody, a woman who was having some problem at work, and she was having problems with her boss, another woman. And she came to see me and wanted some coaching and support in terms of how to deal with the conflict that was arising. We did a tarot card reading, and up popped in the reading the Queen of Swords. Now I will admit that I instinctively felt that this was likely to represent or be a good representation of her boss. Here was this queen, this card that represents authority, rather severe looking with a sword, and she was talking to me about how this woman was kind of, she felt was overly on her case. And so I made the assumption that that card would represent her boss to her. But I checked myself and thought I'm not going to rush into telling her what the cards mean until I find out what she feels they mean. So I said, describe the card. We looked at it in the context of the position and the spread. And I asked her some questions about the card. And then I said, what does this card mean to you? Who might it be? And she looked at the card and she thought and she thought and she thought. And then she said, I think that's me. I realise that I'm actually very critical both of myself and of other people, and sometimes I need to stop being so sharp with people. And I think on reflection I've perhaps been a bit harsh in my dealings with this person. And I thought, wow, here we are, there's a very obvious kind of a connotation that could be drawn from that card, but she has seen something different. And that's not to say that they're not both right, but I respected her interpretation because that was an insight that the card had stimulated for her. Now, if I had started off by saying, oh, this card represents water of air, and it got the it relates to Libra because that's the sign that it relates to in astrology, and blah 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 blah. And it's a woman in a position of authority, so this is almost certainly the boss that you're trying to have a better conversation with. That would have put her into seeing the card in a particular way, and maybe it wouldn't have been the most appropriate way to see the card. So allowing your reader and your querent and yourself, if you're the one doing the inquiry, to see what the cards say to you first is my tip for tarot reading before you start going into all of the systems. And then the systems can allow you to look at that same card from a number of different angles. But don't get obsessed with trying to make all of the systems line up with each other perfectly, because they don't. But they each are like a different pair of glasses that you can put on, and you can look at the card and you'll see something different as a result of using these different systems. So I hope that's been helpful. I hope it's helped to explain some of the connections between the traditional tarot and the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot and the Thoth tarot and the Golden Dawn tarot and some of the astrological and elemental associations. And we'll see. Any thoughts, any questions, pop them below. And although this is not strictly a Tarot to the Nines video, there is a link to the Tarot to the Nines Facebook group below, and you're very welcome to come and join us there and join in the conversation about this kind of stuff and all other kinds of things in relation to tarot and number and tarot systems. And I'd really like to see you engage in this conversation in whichever way you feel most able. So thanks for being here, and until I see you again, take care. Bye.